So welcome everyone to this interview of the scientist Peter Carter. My name's Roger Hallam. I'm one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, and we're doing an interview today with Peter on the science, on the ethics, and on the action that's required in response to the climate emergency. I must say I'm very, very honoured to have Peter here. In my own personal development towards taking action on the climate crisis, Peter's work and videos are very influential on me, and I finally caught up with him 2 or 3 months ago, and I immediately said, let's have you on Reset TV and introduce you to the wider XR audience and people around the world who are struggling to understand what exactly is going on, what needs to happen, and what we need to do. And it doesn't really need me to say this is something that's affecting tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, because every month that goes by, new records are broken, new disasters are happening, and we simply don't have the time, as we'll discuss, to sit around and pretend it's all going to go away, because it's not. So I think we're going to focus sort of initially on the science, and the reason for that, I guess, is because this is the real world. And in a way, I prefer the phrase the real world to the science, because science might sound a bit abstract. So as I see it, it's more like, what's actually going on here? You know, when you put a kettle on to boil, what happens? You know, when you fall off a cliff, what happens? This is like reality. What happens when the Arctic melts? These are practical, scientific, geophysical problems, and they have pretty definite answers. And I also want to say before we start, just to thank everyone who's watching this video, and obviously I encourage you to watch the whole lot, but I want to thank you because it's so difficult to emotionally hold your attention. And we're all subject to this tendency, aren't we, to sort of be vaguely aware of what's going on, or even really profoundly aware of going on, but then we lose focus and we sort of pretend it's not there, and then we come back again. And the reason I guess you're watching this video is because you sort of know there's no escape, there's no turning away. And it's far better and more adult and more grown up and just generally more mature, I suppose, to actually say, okay, this situation is happening, so let's investigate it. Let's know the full facts, the full probabilities. Let's discuss our moral responsibilities, and then let's get on to act. So that's, you know, that's what we're going to do. I don't know quite how well we're going to do it, but we're going to have a shot. And this is part of a series of videos that is being done by XR and Reset TV. Needless to say, I'm speaking, you know, on my own behalf, and so is Peter. We're not talking on behalf of XR or any organisations, and the views expressed will be our own views. So I think that's about it that I've got to say. I'm going to ask Peter to introduce himself. I'm sure he'll do a better job than me. and then once we've done that, I'm going to sort of introduce the sort of science side of it, and then allow Peter to sort of expand on his area expertise, and then we'll go from there. So Peter, thank you so much for being here at this time in history. This is dramatic stuff, isn't it? And thank you so much for agreeing for me to interview you. So if you can, I don't know if people are aware of who you are and what you've done, but if you could just briefly say what you've been up to, that'd be great, and then we'll take it on from there.
Hey, Roger, thanks. And let me say it is truly the greatest pleasure for me to be able to talk to you and to be able to give the best help and support I can to the great Extinction Rebellion movement. So it's really a great pleasure. I'm an expert reviewer of the IPCC. Presently, I'm reviewing the 6th assessment of the IPCC, and previously I reviewed the the big IPCC report of 2018, which had a huge impact, suddenly it had a huge impact on the world, the 1.5 degree C report, because it was following that, and I've been working on the climate emergency for longer than I care to think about. I'm a director of the Climate Emergency Institute. And yeah, the 1.5C report, so it was wonderful. Everybody suddenly clicked and realized, oh my gosh, we are in a climate emergency. So the good news, and there's precious little good news, of course. So the good news is that there continue to be increasing numbers of governments, municipalities, jurisdictions acknowledging and declaring the climate emergency. The scientific community is rather slow on doing that, but I have high hopes that we can help them to acknowledge that we really are in an unprecedented Earth emergency. We're in an emergency of our climate and an emergency of our oceans. And please, yeah,
so
as I go.
So just to clarify, how many years have you been at this then, Peter?
Oh, well, I started, actually, my background, you see, is I'm a medically qualified doctor, but my background is in environmental health protection policy development with Canada, and I started that in, oh my God, 20 years ago, probably.
Right.
A small group of medicos started the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And we initially focused very much on air pollution, pesticides, children's environmental health. But then as the years have rolled by, I've sort of naturally just focused more and more in on, of course, what is the issue of all issues of all time. This is not a big challenge, right? This is not one of many challenges. This is the challenge, right? This is the challenge for all of humanity. So, yeah, I find myself continuing to do this and giving presentations and responding to consultations with the UN, and I'm even continuing to go to present at conferences, for heaven's sake, at my age. So I'll be going to the world's biggest conference at the end of the year, most of which will be virtual. That's very nice for me, and that's the AGU in America.
Right. And what's the AGU? What does that stand for?
The American Geophysical Union, and they have
that's a massive gathering, isn't it?
It's huge. They call it a meeting, right? But they have tens of thousands of experts there. Most of them are sort of doing research on the state of the climate on Mars, for example.
Right.
So, but the scientists seem to be quite happy for me to go to these conferences and push the state of the climate emergency.
So a lot of your work, as I understand it, over the last 20 years then has been following the IPC process,
right.
And these meetings that happen each year. I've forgotten the name of them again now. What are they called? The COPs. Yeah. And you've been to a lot of these, haven't you? I've seen one or two videos of you talking about how horrendous they are. But just to explain briefly for the audience, because not everyone's quite well up on this whole international bureaucracy business. But my understanding is the IPCC, maybe you can just say what it stands for and what its relationship is to the sort of global attempt to reduce carbon emissions, just briefly, so it sort of sets
we have two intergovernmental international organizations which are supposed to respond to the climate emergency and are supposed to keep atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases actually within a safe limit. So the first one is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which we call the UNFCCC. That was signed in 1992, ratified by all nations in 1993. under the auspices of that convention, which, by the way, is a very, very good convention. It's definitely the best of the UN conventions in that sort of human rights and environmental area. Then we have the Climate Secretariat, and the Climate Secretariat was set up to administer the convention. And what they do, and now we are coming up to, this is hard to believe, the 26th annual Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention. So the whole process has increasingly come into a process, not of responding to the climate emergency, but of delaying any response at all. This, of course, is largely due to the influence of powerful big economy countries, nations, and who have worked for all these years to sabotage, in fact, these conferences.
Yeah, well, this brings us to the sort of, the main point of our discussion, isn't it? Which is what's happening in the real world, how bad is it, and why is it so much worse than a lot of people would like to believe? And I suppose it's worth saying, as I understand it, that there's been, 26 of these COPs, and during this period, broadly 30 years, you've seen a 60% increase in carbon emissions.
Right.
And I sort of say this in my talks, and I always feel like it's beyond damning. I find it embarrassing, even by radical standards. Usually make a criticism of an organization, but you can't imagine anything worse, can you? Where it says on the tin, we're here to facilitate the reduction in carbon emissions, and over 26 conferences and presumably millions of hours of negotiations, in inverted commas, this is the outcome. And I think this is, we're going to discuss this a little bit later, but I think one of the reasons Extinction Rebellion came into being is because people were all around the world were going, hang on a minute, these guys are supposed to be reducing this stuff and it's going up. So something isn't working, and we'll come on to discuss that. But what I want to do before we do that is just have you just go through the state of play, as you might say, on what is happening with the climate, and in the broadest sense, because I know you do work on the oceans and what have you, the whole geophysical system, what's going on, why is it so much worse than most people think? And I'm interested, of course, because again, I do, myself and other people in XR do these talks, and who's to believe me? I'm at the end of the day, I'm an organic farmer. I mean, I can do the maths, but there's something powerful about it coming from, a semi-insider, I suppose, as I think you might describe yourself, to sort of say, no, this is it, right? This is science. It's objective. There's probabilities, but it's fundamentally X, Y, and Z. So, for the next 10, 15 minutes or something, let's just go through the terror and horror, as it were, of what we're facing.
Yeah, I've been calling it for some years the terrible truth, and the terrible truth gets honestly more and more terrible. But clearly we have a duty to follow the great example of Extinction Rebellion and face up to the truth and act on the truth, act aggressively on the truth. Recently, thanks to the invitation to these interviews, I've actually been looking into the Extinction Rebellion target of getting to zero in a matter of years. And I just want to say that I kind of surprised myself that this is not only the only right target, it's the only target which gives us a chance, a fighting chance, the only target which gives our children hope. So it's bad. Yes.
Just to clarify, then, that's if people watching this don't know, Extinction Rebellion has a three demands, and the second demand is to reduce carbon to net zero within 5 years, 2025. And as you say, what you're saying is it's necessary, it's possible, and it's the only thing that's giving us a chance of avoiding the worst. Is that your view?
You're right. And the terrible data that I'm going to give you shows that it's a must. It's a must that the whole world aims for this target in a united and pretty aggressive way, right? So we have a great United Nations Secretary General called Antonio Guterres, and for the past 2 years, he has been repeatedly making public statements in which he has told the truth about climate change science. His first statement, which received hardly any publicity, by the way, was his famous statement that climate change is an existential threat, quote, to the survival of life on Earth, particularly including humankind. That's his quote, and that was a huge quote. It's what many of us have been saying for many years, right? Eventually, if we don't act aggressively on emissions and stop a lot of the things that we're doing, then we're going to wipe out ourselves. We're going to end ourselves, and we're going to wipe out most life. We're in a sixth extinction of species already. We've been in that sixth extinction, by the way, for a long time. I recall reading the book by Richard Leakey, the famous anthropologist and evolutionary expert, and he wrote The Sixth Extinction and the Future of Humanity in 1996. So there's no question about that. A recent research paper was published, very recent, by the Stanford group. We're not only in that mass extinction, it's accelerating at an extreme, insane rate. A lot about what we are doing with regards to the climate and the oceans, at best can be called insane, at best. Ethically, you could put it a lot stronger than that. So we had these two statements by Antonio Guterres saying the same thing recently, that if we don't put emissions into rapid decline in 2020, this year, then we are looking at runaway climate change. Just this month, through Twitter, the United Nations Climate Secretariat, these people don't say things without a lot of consideration, a lot of backup by their experts, and a lot of thought. So a Twitter was put out saying the same thing. If we don't act now, then we are facing runaway. Now, I could talk a little bit about the science. The science of climate is all about feedbacks. Positive feedbacks and negative feedbacks, which naturally and normally vary within ranges of a balance, right? Dangerous climate change, and it is now catastrophically dangerous climate change. I mean, we have disasters and catastrophes, right? Catastrophic impacts, I mean, every year, right? I mean, we've had horrendous floods in Asia, widespread floods in Asia, including China this year. So the science of dangerous climate change is all about amplifying feedbacks, which are confusingly called by the science positive feedbacks. They're positively bad. Bad feedbacks is what they are. The research is coming in, my task that I set myself was to keep up with the research and document the research on my websites so that I'd have them and other people could have them when they began to get seriously interested in climate change. It's really next to impossible to keep up with all the research now. It really is crazy. And of course, all the research is bad news. The latest research, I just got it yesterday. is a confirmation from the experts in this field that the Arctic is in a state of abrupt climate change, in a state of abrupt Arctic heating. And this research paper pointed out that if you go back into the distant past, thousands of years and tens of thousands of years, these abrupt changes in the Arctic with changes in the sea ice trigger abrupt global, rapid global temperature increase. So this is also what a lot of us have been very, very concerned, afraid of for many years, would be runaway triggered by multiple amplifying feedbacks from the planet. The runaway and feedbacks, it's pretty easy to explain actually. Global surface warming has effects on the surface of the planet in that emit more emissions on top of our emissions that makes global warming worse. So inherently, the science of global warming and the science of feedbacks is the most important part of the science of global warming. Global warming increases global warming, and that happens more and more and more the higher the global temperature rises and the longer the length of time that that global temperature has been applying. Today, and I monitor all of the data, I have my sort of amateur websites, and one of them I call State of Our Climate. So that gets me to remember to monitor all the data pretty well every month, okay? Or everything, and I presented this actually over the past 3 years to these big science conferences in America, San Francisco, and in Europe, Vienna, in which I presented the data to everybody and given the conclusion, which is pretty clear, that if you put it all together, we have a biosphere which is trending to collapse. We, I don't mean all of humanity. When I say we, I mean my lot. I mean the what I call the Euro-American civilization culture, what we call the economy, the consumer growth of everything, right? As much as possible all the time. It's that economy, right? So it's a very small minority of the history of the human race. I have profound respect for humanity. I've been a doctor working in emergency medicine most of my life. Human beings are great, but their leaders that we have put into positions of power are not great. That's our big problem. And Extinction Rebellion clearly recognizes that and is working to put pressure on our leaders. So everything's accelerating, everything's at record high. In a nutshell, everything's getting worse faster. The global surface temperature increase for the first 6 months of this year, 2020, is 1.3 degrees C. Now, it is now generally acknowledged that 2 degrees C is out of the question catastrophe, right? It triggers runaway for sure. So the scientists have all switched, and I commend them for it. It's just been great to see how everybody has got together and agreed that the danger limit is 1.5 degrees C. Today we're at 1.3. A world at 1.5 degrees C, I presented some years at Oxford University 1.5 degrees C conference, is a disastrous world, no question. 2 degrees C is an impossible world. Unfortunately, we still read in articles, in papers, references to 2 degrees C. It's crazy, right? If we allow the climate to warm up to 2 degrees C, right, we're gone. We are not going to see 4 degrees C. We will not be around. And there's many reasons for that. So that's the global surface temperature, and the scientists acknowledged earlier in the year that global surface heating is accelerating over the past 10 years. That means it's been accelerating all along on the long term. That means, and the graphs are truly dramatic. When we get to 2009, 2010, it just goes straight up, literally goes straight up. And that's just the surface warming. And one has to remember that that's sort of the warming that's left over, because 93% of the heat that we've added to the lower atmosphere, 93% has been taken up by the oceans. So the heat in the oceans is accelerating very obviously up to the present time. I want to stress that when I say these things are accelerating, they're accelerating up to the past year or two, right? It's now. So that brings me to remind myself that we have always tended to see and assess and plan climate change as something in the future. It's no longer in the future. This is very, very, very clear. It's hitting us hard on all continents, not just the developing poorer regions, but in the developed regions. Look at what happened to Europe last year. And we had another record huge heat wave, heat dome in the United States earlier this year, and another one in Europe as well earlier this year. And these are breaking records every year. So climate change is, catastrophic climate change is today. That's one of many reasons in general why Extinction Rebellion is right to put a target of 0 in a matter of years. Absolutely right. All of the other targets are wrong. None of the other targets are going to prevent global climate planetary catastrophe. They will not, because the atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations are accelerating like never before. Obviously, the most important thing is not actually global surface temperature. The most important thing is the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. How much the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has been built up by constantly emitting these greenhouse gases, right? It's constant. And of course, we all realize that carbon dioxide is the most important one. The others are crucially important. We have to get them all down to near 0. And I'm going to use the term near 0 or virtual 0 here, because that's what the IPCC said in as a quote in its last assessment in 2014. And that's what the graphs and calculations showed in the 1.5 degrees C report. How bad is atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration then is how bad the climate system is. And as you pointed out, Roger, it's climate system. It involves all the systems, all the Earth systems are involved by the climate system. Recent research just published a couple of weeks ago, atmospheric carbon dioxide is now the highest in 23 million years. That's insane. That's absolute climate crazy. You only have to know that to start, getting agitated, right? Agitated. And for everybody, to give up this sort of placid sort of, no passion, sort of no feeling into the science. No. The science is shouting. The science is yelling at us now. And we have to yell back like Extinction Rebellion is doing. And so I am hoping that more and more and more people join your now global association, as well as other organizations. I have my favorite ones. Extinction Rebellion is definitely on the top of that list. So 23 million years, but it gets worse than that. The World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, which is really very, very good on publications on climate. In 2017, they said that atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration over the past few years was increasing at a rate with no known past precedent. Now, we can go back 40, 50 million years, right, on carbon dioxide. Scientists, it's just amazing what they can do. Absolutely amazing. But we are increasing the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere faster than in the past 40 million years. That is 100 to 200 times faster than happens naturally, ending ice ages and bringing us into a warm period. So, I think you only have to, reflect on these numbers, right, to realize we're in trouble with respect to our survival. Climate change is now. It's now the survival of our children. It's not grandchildren anymore. We're looking at children the world over. And I stress, not just in the poor, vulnerable, most vulnerable developing world. Oh, no, no, no. In the United States, definitely in Europe. I don't quite understand why the models which are being proved out, has Europe extreme heat waves, like worse actually than anywhere in the world. I don't quite understand that, but that's what we're seeing. That's what's happening, and that's what's going to get worse, right? And to stop it getting worse to an unlivable, intolerable situation, yeah. 2020 is the year. All the scientists have been agreed on this for many years, that at the absolute latest, global emissions must decline fast from 2020. Methane is the second most important greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide, of course, is of special importance because of ocean acidification, right? And ocean acidification, the highest in 14 to 17 million years, also accelerating. That's ocean acidification. Now, methane. Methane is, I should point out for the people that do know the numbers, carbon dioxide is now at 414 parts per million. Safety limit is 350. Methane is now at 1,800 parts per million. The scientists, 1,800 parts per billion. Scientists are really actually very alarmed about this. They did not expect methane to be doing this. And one of the reasons why they didn't expect methane to be doing that is that the 800,000 year limit of methane, the ice cores give us the absolute limits, the highest levels over 800,000 years, is 800 parts per billion. We're now at 1,800 parts per billion. The 1 million year limit on carbon dioxide, we actually have a core that goes back a million years now, is 300 parts per million. We're now at 414, right? So ocean heat content accelerating. Just a few years ago, the media publicized pretty well the world's leading expert on ocean heating, who took the trouble to work out how many Hiroshima bombs would need to be exploded to be equivalent to the amount of heat that we've added to the oceans. A few years ago, it was 3 Hiroshima bombs per second. It's now 5 Hiroshima bombs per second. And that's real. That is the real amount of energy that we're adding mostly to the oceans. At the same time as ocean heating, which is very bad for the oceans, we have ocean acidification I've mentioned. And with ocean heating, we have ocean deoxygenation. We are robbing the oceans of oxygen with the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we are putting out constantly and constantly building up. And today, rather than responding on an emergency basis, rather than responding to Extinction Rebellion type targets, we're not decarbonizing. The rate of decarbonization has actually slowed in the past few years. So we're doing things worse instead of doing things better. The Arctic. Yes, the scientists have told us for years and years and years that the Arctic's crucially important to the entire planet. What they've said is what happens to the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. That's now become a sort of famous statement. And they've explained that if the Arctic sea ice melts away, then we're in big, big, big trouble, because we're looking at hundreds of square miles of Arctic sea ice reflection cooling the Arctic and the Northern Hemisphere and the planet as a whole, we're looking at that switching from a cooling to a warming, as the open ocean has the best or biggest capacity for absorbing heat on our planet. So this research paper just published, we are in abrupt climate change, and that triggers abrupt climate change on the planet as a whole. The Arctic has switched. In 2016, the NOAA, the US National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, they're kind of, in a way, the top agency for monitoring all the data, along with NASA, but NOAA is probably regarded as the top one, gives out most data. And they publish an Arctic report card every year. In 2016, shocking, was not picked up by the media. They said, with a long chapter with great illustrations, that the Arctic permafrost, warming, thawing, and emitting, had switched the Arctic from a carbon sink to a carbon source. So this is Earth catastrophe news. This is Earth catastrophe, actual, not modeling, actual scientific finding today. Last year in 2019, they went back to look at the research. They looked at more research, the NOAA, and confirmed that the Arctic is switched. It has switched from a sink, from taking in on the net basis, taking in and absorbing some CO2, to now the CO2 and the methane, which is coming out of the Arctic from the melting permafrost, exceeds the ability of the Arctic, right, to absorb. Still absorbing, but it's putting out more. And that will clearly get worse and worse and worse as the abrupt Arctic heating continues to get worse. People like to sort of track when the Arctic is going to be ice-free. I find that a little bit frustrating, actually, because what we're interested in is the total, what's called albedo loss. We're interested in the amount of total loss of sea ice since from about June up to September, and that's huge. But this year, the Arctic and we're into, we're into summer now, and the Arctic sea ice, the low is actually in September, but it's a record. So right now we're into another record situation in which there is a record absence of Arctic sea ice, and that sea ice cushions us from what would otherwise be even worse, global surface heating. Those are the, well, I got to give you the dramatic ones, I suppose, that there's no question of. Horrible, horrible news. We've lost the Great Barrier Reef. That's been rather obvious for a few years. In the summer of Australia, which is early in the year, so we have all the reports and we have all the measurements collated. The Great Barrier Reef suffered its third major bleaching in 5 years. Nothing like this has ever happened before to the Great Barrier Reef. We have two jewels on Earth, don't we? I think we sort of all know this. One on land, the Amazon, and the other tropical rainforest, but primarily the Amazon, and the jewel of the ocean. We've always regarded as the Great Barrier Reef, the biggest living organism on the planet, easily viewable from space, and a wonderful example of how life helps each other and lives together in mutualism and thrives and produces this incredible, actually, single organism of all of this coral. Marine heat waves is what happened. And the Terry Hughes, Dr. Terry Hughes, who is the world's expert on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, recently said, if global warming continues, the barrier reef is gone. Well, global warming is obviously going to continue, even if we, and we must, aim for immediate rapid decline of emissions to zero in a matter of years. Even if we do that, warming is going to continue, right? So that's the fundamental science. And that's another thing which makes the Extinction Rebellion policy, right, so right. It's actually totally right by the science. The Amazon, I track the Amazon fires in the Amazon fire season. I've been doing it for probably about 6 years now. It's a very visually easy thing to do, thanks to NASA. They have a web page called FIRMS, F-I-R-M-S, and they're satellites. They've got 2 satellites up there which interpret the fires. I was absolutely shocked to my core because just earlier this month, we had more fires in the Amazon than I've ever seen, like way, way, way more. And this is early in the Amazon fire season. And those fires, I look at them every couple of days now. They are now encroaching and swallowing up the entire Amazon. There's a fire line right now, right across the middle of the Amazon. We, and when I say we, I mean we who support what we call the economy, right? We're totally destroying the Amazon. We're totally burning it up. These fires, by the way, are intentional. It's not just the Amazon. The biggest area of bright red fires that you see on the map is in Africa, is sub-Saharan Africa, where they burn every year all of the grasses. These fires produce massive amounts of carbon dioxide, but also a lot of methane, and also, of course, black carbon soot going up in the air. And you know, nobody's even saying that we got to stop starting these fires. I mean, we complain about the government in the Amazon, but it's not that simple, right? The international community has to act so that people are not setting fires in the Amazon anymore. They have to make it economically viable, this can be done, that the Amazon is left intact and not destroyed. That means, as many people, many people have said for decades, countless books and papers, we have to change our economy fundamentally, because we live under an economy which is inherently destructive of the entire planet. So that we have to do. I could go on, but that's about it for the bad news, I suppose. Now, I can't hear you, Roger.
Yeah, so thanks. I mean, I've let you sort of summarize that, because there's no, it just needs to be said, doesn't it, what the overview is. And one of the big problems is, I'm sure many people are aware, is you just get a scientist talking about a little bit over here or a little bit over there. And it's a bit like talking about little bits of a body. You need to know what's happening to the whole thing. It's all connected, right? Otherwise, it's fairly illogical. And what you've done brilliantly is just, you know, lay out the top things that are going on: the Arctic, the methane, permafrost situation, the Great Barrier Reef, the forest fires. And in the context of this fundamental understanding, which I think a lot of people haven't quite understood, is once you've triggered this, it continues without you having to do anything. That's my understanding of a feedback. So you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and then you melt the Arctic, and then more carbon comes out. You know, and as you say, it produces more carbon than it absorbs. And so, in principle, like, if you stop, the whole thing's carrying on. It's like you've started an engine or something, isn't it? It's like it's on the go. And I think this is the full horrific sort of realization, which is if we don't stop soon, we're done for whatever we do, because it's going to be off and away. And realistically speaking, it's not like you can switch it off tomorrow anyway. I mean, you know, a matter of years, yes. So we've still got a few years to, you know, even if everyone was totally with the program on it, it's still going to take a few years to get down to zero. So you've got that problem. So what I want to just establish, and I think this is something people shy away from, and it's got enormous sort of moral and even spiritual implication, which is what you said at the beginning. And a lot of scientists just sort of briefly go over it. You know, you've got this phrase, an existential threat, and you think, oh, well, you know, that doesn't sound that good. But just to make absolutely clear here, what we're looking at is having no human beings on the planet forever, right? That's what extinction means, is it not? I mean, that's what we're talking about. Can you just confirm to everyone, as a scientist, that's what an existential threat means? It's not some abstract thing. It means there's no humans, and when there's no humans, there's going to be no humans for infinity.
Yeah. I mean, as our UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, you know, this is now an existential threat. That's a threat to our survival. That's what it is. But you see, we're in the sixth extinction, right? And it's accelerating at an unbelievable pace. It's almost certainly the most rapid extinction that the Earth has ever experienced. Now, we still have a wonderful planet, right? We still have perhaps more life than has ever been on this Earth. We certainly had more life than when you and I came into the world, Roger. But we're getting rid of life at an insane rate. Okay. Ethically, I applaud actually a statement that Mary Robinson, who was the premier of Ireland some years ago, and is a great campaigner on human rights, and she has been working on climate change over the past few years. So she made a statement at a big meeting that continuing to emit greenhouse gases and keeping the climate change is evil. It is evil, right? And it's evil because if we continue, as you say, if we continue to emit, right, there's no question about what's going to happen, right? The Earth is going to get an intolerable place to live in, with intolerable heat waves. But those heat waves won't just be intolerable, they will trash our crops, because there's a definite limit of heat that crops can tolerate, even with irrigation, after which the crops are gonna fail. But the other thing is that if we haven't triggered it already, and we may well have done, we definitely will trigger runaway. That will definitely pour much more and increasingly more and more greenhouse gas emissions into the planet. And as you say, permafrost reaches a temperature increase where it's completely irreversible. And the latest on permafrost is there's 2.5 times all the carbon in the atmosphere in the permafrost until recently safely frozen away year round, right? So yeah.
So to clarify, just to clarify this permafrost business, just to so people understand, like there's this ice in the soil. The soil is frozen, and it heats up. And as everyone knows, when things heat up, the ice melts. So the permafrost melts. There's no question about this. This is about as basic physics as you can get. And in that permafrost is the methane. And there's no question that it's going to come out if it melts, right? I mean, to my mind, it's a matter, there's no question about the physics here, right? It's a question of how much comes out, how fast, but it will all come out if it gets really hot.
But Roger,
That's
it's worse than the methane. The thawing permafrost is emitting, where the research has been done in various regions in the Arctic, is emitting methane, yes, but is emitting carbon dioxide, and way more carbon dioxide than anybody ever thought could be possible, right? And nitrous oxide. So the melting permafrost is emitting all three of the big greenhouse gases. And if we don't act and get emissions to zero in a matter of years, that's just going to continue to increase and increase and increase and increase. There was a paper that got a lot of publicity year before last, and that was what the media call the hothouse Earth paper. So that was a good one that explained all of these feedbacks and described them as cascading feedbacks. A good description is the domino effect. So you start one and they go on and on and on and on and on, and then you just get more feedback. But they're actually all happening at the same time. Now, I just wanted to mention that there's actually nothing new about people who have a lot of experience and a knowledge saying that we're on track to wipe ourselves out. We have to act to save ourselves from ourselves, and that's because of the sixth extinction. That's because of the sixth extinction. Years ago, people were saying, well, you know, it's not just all the species that are going to go extinct. We have to have ecosystems supporting us. We can't live without nature.
Well, let's just have a look at that, because that's one of the things, you know, I think there's two things we've established. Number one is if this carries on, there's going to be no humans left. The humans are going to die, and that's going to be the end of the human race. That's point one. And point two seems to be the mechanism through which this happens is through compounding effects and positive feedbacks. Lots of different things triggering themselves, triggering each other, and then triggering themselves even more and even more. Because we've started this off, right? So, you know, often this is sort of presented in quite a clinical way, and people say, well, that's the end of the human race. So, you know, let's just spend a few minutes just being honest with ourselves that it's not like suddenly someone will click their fingers and the human race is going to disappear. As I see it, and maybe there's no words to adequately describe this, we're looking at the suffering and death of billions of human beings. This isn't like they just get up one morning and die, right? This is a slow death scenario for billions of people. And just explain it, if you don't mind, like, you know, one or two of the mechanisms through which this mass death happens.
Yeah, mainly it's food and water, of course, right? Global surface heating and climate change causes multiple damaging adverse impacts on crops, which far outweigh, as the temperature and the climate goes up and up, which it is doing, which far outweighs the theoretical benefits of a mildly warmer climate in which there's a longer growing season, and perhaps a bit of an increase in carbon dioxide will help crops. I should mention that carbon dioxide has resulted in a fertilization effect of the forests. Yes, the forests have been greening up, but at the same time, there's been this slow, gradual process, but continuous process of damaging the forests through drying and drought, fires, and heat waves, right? So the forests are not okay. They're not okay at all. I mentioned the Amazon, and I should also mention the shocking situation in Siberia, because Siberia holds most of the world's permafrost. And we have unprecedented fires right across Siberia today. And those fires in Siberia are actually never going out. In Russia, they're calling them zombie fires, because they just subside, but they keep burning under the peat. And then when we get into the spring and summertime, and it's only been the springtime that's done this, whoosh, up they come again. And as I say, they're emitting vast amounts of carbon dioxide. So That's one huge feedback
Yeah.
is forest fires. Yeah. I've forgotten what you asked now. I'm sorry.
So without beating around the bush, we're looking at mass starvation.
Yeah, that's sorry. That's the primary thing. And we have not been looking. We really haven't been looking at the effect of climate change on crops. The reason why we haven't been looking is that early on in the days of research, we had actually the worst, the most naive, the most incomplete models were the models on climate and crops. And those models, and they got reported, said, oh, the Northern Hemisphere, the United States, Europe doesn't have to worry, right? We're not only gonna be able to live out climate change this century, we're probably gonna be able to grow more food. And this is stuck. So this really is still in the thinking of the governments and the bureaucracy. And almost 10 years ago, the research progressed and progressed and progressed. And we realized, no, this is not the case on every continent, particularly in the United States and particularly in Europe. Our crops are highly vulnerable to these many adverse impacts happening in terms of the crops at the same time, which is going to reduce and reduce and reduce yields. Any projection that you look at in terms of where global temperature is going to stop at, right? Whether it's 1.5 C, we're going to lose food production. And the latest models, they all show this. So yeah, there was one book that was published called The Uninhabitable Planet, wasn't it, right? So in scientific terms, as I put it, all the accelerating data trends together result in a trend that the biosphere is in a state of collapse. That means that the human species, although there's a heck of a lot of us, and although we still live on a beautiful planet, that means that nature is not going to support us any longer if we continue to trash the planet.
There's a specific mechanism, I think, here. I mean, obviously, I've been a farmer for 20 years, and one of the things that I have difficulty communicating to people is to destroy a crop, you don't need to be at like 20 degrees centigrade or something higher than normal. You just need it to be 20 degrees higher than normal for like 2 weeks.
That's right. And that's what
because once you've killed a crop, it's like, it's like human beings. Once the crop's gone, it's not coming back. And then if that's happening, on the critical mass of different places, like I think it did about 3 years ago when food production was down 20% in the US, Europe and Russia, wasn't it, or thereabouts, then if that continues for 2 or 3 years, you're literally going to run out of food. There's going to be
we have research, Roger, which has looked at the possibility of what they call multiple simultaneous breadbasket failure. And they say, yes, that's what we're heading for.
And what that translates into everyday life is you go to the supermarket and there's no food. That's the immediate reality we're talking. I mean, when you say the end of the human race, it sounds a little bit science fiction in the abstract, but what you're basically saying is at some point in the next few years, you'll go to the supermarket and there's going to be no bread or there's going to be no pasta.
Yeah. I mean, it should be well recognized that the past 10,000 years, when we made our greatest invention ever, agriculture, right? The past 10,000 years has been most unusually stable with respect to the climate, most unusual. And all at the same time, and this is fascinating, in various parts of the world, agriculture was developed about 11,000 years ago. And then we've just got better and better and better at agriculture. Actually, we're now too good on agriculture. Agribusiness is not good. And we know, and the research confirms, that in all aspects, organic agriculture mixed with hedgerows, woodlots, right, is the best form of agriculture. So we definitely do have to switch our agriculture, because our modern agriculture is a huge emitter of greenhouse gases. But
Yeah.
yeah, we are heading, all of our energy and climate plans of all governments and corporations, right, are all for not only continued greenhouse gas emissions, but for continued increasing greenhouse gas emissions. So we fundamentally change, we disrupt the entire climate seasonal system, with more and more and more extreme weather events happening, and they're all damaging to crops. So we're headed for a post-agricultural world. We're changing the climate of the past 10,000 years into a completely different climate, which is not an agricultural climate.
And when you say a post-agricultural world, what we're saying, again, to be blunt, is not enough food to feed people.
That's right.
And billions of people starving to death.
That's right. And in actual fact, that one of the leading climate experts from the UK works in Manchester, in fact, in 2009. He said this is going to happen if we don't, this was the Copenhagen year, if we don't have, as everybody expected in 2009, it's now 10 years later, if we don't have a very powerful international agreement, right, to slash emissions, he said, yeah, we're looking at billions of people not able to survive because of starvation, water deprivation. And then, of course, you pile on the diseases. For many, many, many years, the infectious disease experts, we've just had an experience of it with COVID-19, have warned us that actually all of the infectious and communicable diseases are going to be increased by putting up the global temperature and lots of floods. It's a recipe, it's a suicidal recipe, and the only plans we have are plans for global suicide.
Yeah, and you know, like, as someone that's got more of a social science background, for me, like, there's also tipping points and positive feedbacks in social systems as well. That if you've got not enough food and you've got infectious diseases, then you're going to create social breakdown. Social breakdown is going to reduce security. Security is going to make it more difficult to transport food, to grow food, which is going to create more infectious disease, which is going to create more social breakdown. In other words, like, all these things are interrelated, right?
Yes.
And they go exponential. You know, social breakdown is an area of academic study, as we both know, and it happens fast. It doesn't just gradually creep up on societies.
Right.
Once a society, you know, passes a certain point, then it all cascades downwards into chaos and slaughter and death. And that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, we're now looking at what people call, you know, the unthinkable, but we can't afford not to think about it. So the great thing about Extinction Rebellion is challenging us to think about it and look at it. And it's bleak, it's grim, it's very late in the day. The 2007 IPCC assessment stressed over and over and over that emissions had to be in decline by 2015 for a 2-degree sea limit. We're years too late. So we really have to give ourselves a good kick out the backside, and really everybody has to take a hard look at this, right?
So, you know, I want to bring us on then to something that you've been very vocal about and have been so impressed by, because so many scientists, I mean, a lot of presentations would finish here, wouldn't they? I've watched hundreds of presentations of the science, and the science, you know, most of the time the scientists will say, so to summarize, we face an existential threat. A few of the scientists will actually go on and actually admit we're looking at the indescribable suffering and death of billions of people. And that's
Yeah.
just starting to happen. But no one hardly actually talks about the moral and political implications of what actually it means to knowingly and consciously, in full view of the science, engage in a project that is going to lead to this much suffering. And I'd like you just to say, you know, you use this word evil and you use the word crime.
Mm.
Why have you used those words? Why do you think that's appropriate at this point?
Yeah, and it's truly amazing that we're getting all of this terrible news about the climate, right? And we're getting news of these terrible people, right, who are completely denying that we have dangerous climate change, anything like that. And these people who are pushing more fossil fuel production, which means more fossil fuel burning, right? I was fortunate enough to team up with my co-author in 2018, a really good writer. I'm not a really good writer. And she had gone to all the COPs, all the United Nations conferences, a lady called Elizabeth Woodward. And we wrote the book called Unprecedented Crime, Climate Science Denial. And yeah, we went into it in a big way, and we got in touch with all the social science and human rights experts. And yeah, it's a crime. It's a crime against humanity. It's actually a crime against all humanity, right? If we start calling it a crime as it is, I call it the crime of all time, then at least we will switch the discussion to a level that people can actually understand, right? You know, you could give people all these numbers, but they're just numbers. You can show people graphs, but they're just graphs, right? We are now, our business model, our perverse, irrational economics is destroying us. It's destroying the planet. And that means destroying us, obviously. But it's worse than a crime. It's worse than a crime against all humanity. Why is it that, see, we've always had in our philosophy, in our interpretation of life, our Western culture has always had this standard of good and evil, right? Other cultures I don't think do, but we have. And so that's fundamental, that we grow up so that we can understand the difference between good and we can understand what is evil. And our standard for evil is, of course, you know, the Nazi fascist conquest of Europe and the concentration camps, killing first protesters and then people with deficiencies and then gypsies and then people of the Jewish faith. And that's our standard of evil, right? And it's, yeah, millions of people. Well, we're looking at billions of people now. So obviously, disrupting the entire climate of the planet, disrupting all the oceans, poisoning the oceans, the entire oceans, with acidification, with heating, which disturbs and breaks down all the healthy ocean currents, and deoxygenation. This is evil. When I was a young man and I was immersed in the Christian religion, I got to a stage when I was probably 15 in which I was looking for something better than what I was sort of hearing about, right? And I discovered, and this is Second World War Nazi content, I discovered Bonhoeffer. And of course, Bonhoeffer, the great quote attributed to Bonhoeffer, who was a German minister, who ended up losing his life right at the end of the war. They executed him. And he was very, very outspoken. There were Germans, Europeans occupied who were very outspoken about what was happening and the evil that was happening. And what he said then was that not to make a statement of evil is evil in itself, right? Essentially, that's what he said. If you're looking at something which is clearly evil, and if you don't call it evil, then you're complicit in that evil. I think people can understand that, right? We want to be good. We all do. Apart from some of those psychopaths, which unfortunately we have this crazy system which tends to put them in positions of great power, but they're a tiny minority. We want to be good. We don't want to be involved in something that's evil.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? If that's the right word. I mean, I think you've made a particular move there, Peter, which I think people are waking up to. And it's not just that what we're looking at is evil. I mean, that's, as you say, it's unavoidable. It's an unavoidable, billions of deaths. I mean, I've struggled with that. I mean, I think many millions of people are struggling at this moment in time with this bottom line situation, which is billions of deaths. And then on top of that, I think we're just beginning to realize, as you say, with the Bonhoeffer sort of situation of saying, if you don't act against that evil, if you don't call that evil evil, you are complicit. And that's like an enormously powerful and emotional realization. And I think you're dead right, which is, once you know, there's no escape from moral responsibility. If people don't know about it, then they can't be responsible.
Right.
But everyone that's listened to this video, to be blunt, knows, and I'm sure many people that have listening to this video have known for a while. And, you come in and out of it, don't you? But what you're saying, and I think this is a transformative point, is there's no escape once you know, in terms of deciding whether you're going to be complicit or whether you're going to name it and then act upon it. Right. I mean, that seems to be the situation at this stage.
And it's not difficult to act on it, right? The most effective, definitely effective, immediately effective, readily doable action that everybody in the world can do is go vegan. In theory, we can all do that. If we do that, emissions drop immediately, mainly because of methane, but also because of carbon dioxide, because if we go vegan and there's no livestock meat industry anymore, we're not cutting down the Amazon for pasture and soy for feeding cattle, right? So huge decline in emissions. 35% is the highest that I was able to find on the research. Okay, and when I was looking for how can we do, because we must do, how can we do zero emissions in a matter of years? So yeah, there's the immediate thing. I want to mention now the COVID lesson, the COVID example. Now, much has been written about the COVID experience, which has been an amazing worldwide experience. But to me, the big thing is that emissions dropped a huge amount and dropped fast. There was a paper published that looked at the maximum amount of emissions decline in countries in April. It was 26%. We can do an immediate 26% drop in emissions. Do the math, right?
Yeah.
And it gets better, because most of that, they worked out which activities, right, were changing to reduce emissions, and most of it was transport. We stayed at home, right? So we can do this huge immediate drop in emissions, and not only survive, we can keep following a decent living, right? With no
Yeah.
terrible, awful suffering. So there's a great lesson in COVID, which is this is doable.
Yeah, yeah, and this comes back to responsibility, doesn't it? That it's not an act of nature to put this amount of carbon into the atmosphere. It's a political decision due to a political desire, a political program. And as being a political situation, it's changeable. It's within our control. I mean, we've got, as you say, we've got the unavoidable social evidence of the last 6 months. When decision makers make the decision, they can reduce carbon emissions in a matter of weeks by 25%. Fact. There's no dispute about that. Which brings us back to the collective responsibility we have as human beings and as citizens to make sure this happens in order to not be complicit in the evil that is obviously in front of us. And as you've rightly said, there's enormous changes in our personal lifestyles that are now necessary. Let's not beat around the bush. They're necessary. It's necessary for people to become vegan. It's necessary for people to massively reduce their travel. It's necessary for people to review their lifestyles, their jobs, their careers, because we're facing the massive and indescribable suffering of billions of people if we don't. Period, right? I mean, that seems unavoidable. I mean, I'd love to be able to avoid it, but I can't avoid that conclusion. And then the broader, yeah.
I should make clear that I've been a part of this evil myself, right? I mean,
yeah.
I was a highly paid person, right? Big fast cars, boats, the whole. I've been there, right? That was evil, okay, and I've changed. I've changed very slowly. We all have to change, as I say, very fast. Now, evil is it's not a person who is evil, right? If you go in and study what it means, which you know, it's actually a result. Evil is a result, right? So this greatest evil, manifestly the greatest evil that we've ever seen, right? Ever seen, nothing compares to it, is very simply the result of our energy production and our food production. It's really simple, right? And it's not only advantageous for all of us to survive, for our children to survive, for us to get those emissions into decline now in a matter of years, it's for our own health. 3 to 4 million, the highest number I came across was 4 million people a year are killed from fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry is killing 4 million people a year. And imagine how much disabling and suffering that is, right? That is a evil. That is a great evil, continuing to do that when you know you've been doing it for years. It's an evil result. It's an evil situation which must be stopped.
Yeah, and this is it, isn't it? I mean, I don't think anything you've said today is particularly different to what the scientists were predicting 30 years ago. The only difference is we've actually got the hard data now. We can look at the real world and we can see it. So it's no longer a prediction, it's here, as you rightly said. And I think, you know, just to move towards the end of our discussion, I think you've rightly said there's massive changes that are necessary in terms of people's lifestyles. And there's also massive changes in government policy that need to be changed. And as you know, Extinction Rebellion has been at the forefront of a fundamentally new message, which is if a government doesn't change, it's your right, and as we've identified, your duty, if you're not going to be complicit, to go into a rebellion, a non-violent civil disobedience against the government in order to fundamentally reduce carbon emissions. It's not actually that complicated, is it?
Yeah, I think there's a problem. If you ask the average person who controls the economy, right, they know it's the banks, it's the big banks, right? And we had the banks. I think they did it pretty deliberately. 10 years ago, they pulled our chain, and we had the most massive transfer of wealth that the world has ever seen. The bank bailout, right? Trillions and trillions of dollars. We're seeing the same thing now with COVID, and the banks have got to be behind it, right? If the banks wanted and decided that emissions have to decline from today fast in a matter of years, the banks can do it, right? Because the banks hold the strings. All governments now are in a massive amount of national debt, right? So we have an axis of evil, if you want. We have the big banking corporations, we have the big fossil fuel corporations, and we have the compliant governments who clearly, our Canadian government, I mean, our government is full of nice people, right? They are pushing more and more fossil fuels with billions of dollars. Billions and billions of dollars they're handing out. And now we've got the same thing on COVID, okay? So the COVID recovery response is now an evil response because it's just pushing it's pushing the terrible day. And I'm glad you mentioned the suffering, Roger, right? So, we are human beings. We all have compassion. None of us like to see other human beings suffering. None of us like that, especially if we can actually get to the point which we really do see it, right? And especially when it's, people in our own family, right? So the unavoidable suffering is now absolutely terrible. Terrible.
Something I've been working on, for the last 2 years is to try and make this argument, here's the science, here's the moral responsibility, and here's you with your choices, what are you going to do with your life? And I think, to finish off, you put your finger on it, that at the end of the day, we're talking about what's going to be happening to people we love, our children, our grandchildren, our relatives, the people in our communities. They're going to be starving at some point if we don't deal with this. And that's the sort of gulp in the throat moment, isn't it? Which is coming into the realization of hundreds of millions of people. This is not something abstract. It's not something in 2100. It's in the next 10 or 20 years. It's a casino. No one knows who's going to be hit next. But what we do know is it's going to be exponentially worse, the casino that we're entering into. And it's a casino of death. It's a casino of massive suffering, unknown in the human experience. I mean, that's what you've been saying for the last hour or so. And for me, for Extinction Rebellion, we have to do something with that agitation, don't we? That, all the people that have got to this point in this video know, because that's why they're still watching this video. Most people, or many people, switch it off after 10 minutes because it's like, I don't want to go there. But if you're at this point in the video, and we know as Extinction Rebellion what we need to do, which is to engage in civil disobedience, which is to break the law in order to uphold the higher moral law. And we're making this video at the beginning of August. And in September, the first week of September, and the details of this are at the bottom of this video, Extinction Rebellion in the UK will be going into rebellion against the British government in order to overcome this evil that we've been talking about, to actually get concrete reductions in carbon emissions. Is there anything you want to say before we finish, Peter?
Yeah, I just have one final comment. Years ago, it was clear, it was published in some magazines that the human race was at a crossroads. that we were looking at what was described as the worst possible future or the best possible future. And that was absolutely right. It was described very well. We're not only robbing our children of a decent life and in fact their lifetimes, their lives, we're robbing them of what I would call a golden age. You don't have to have much imagination to think about a world in which there's no fossil fuel energy, no fossil fuel pollution, right? It's all clean, renewable energy. It's getting more the more we use it. The more we use it, it's getting cheaper. The energy is available to everyone. Everyone on the planet can produce and use this energy. Plus, we're not slaughtering billions of other animals and eating them. We're not doing that, right? We are growing the best, nutritious, healthy plants. Now, of course, we have the industries that are making great products, real juicy, tasty products, right? For vegan, it's easy to be a vegan now. When I started, it wasn't that easy. This world, which should be our human destiny, is a golden, glorious world in which, at the same time, because we're not polluting the planet, we're not poisoning the oceans anymore, the earth is recovering, the earth is replenishing, right? The earth is becoming rich, rich, rich again, right? The earth can become as rich and as wonderful as when you and I, Roger, entered into this, living on this fabulous, fabulous planet.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. I mean, it feels like we've investigated the depths of the greatest horrors and the potential for the greatest good. I haven't, words continually fail me when I talk about all this, so I don't know whether that sums it up. But thank you so much for joining us. And thank you everyone for the bravery of seeing it through to this point. And just to reiterate again, you know, action, action, action. There's no other way forward now to overcome our complicity in what's coming down the road. The details are at the bottom of this video if you're watching it on YouTube. And yes, thank you. We're all going to get to it.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you for everybody that's managed to listen to us. Thank you.
Thanks.